So now that we have the ability to, once we press the tap me button, it gives us 1 onto our score and increases as many times as we press the button itself. We're now going to move on to having the ability to create some kind of game control. So the first time we switch to this view, by default what we've got currently set up, we can press the button as many times as we want straight away without the game actually starting. So what we're going to create now is our start game timer. We have the ability to, once this view loads up, we're going to create a 3, 2, 1 starter, and once it reaches 0, our game then becomes playable. And by meaning playable, it means initially we're going to have this tap button disabled. When the 3, 2, 1 has happened, it's reached 0, this button will become enabled, and then in the next coming lectures we'll set up our time remaining to create our countdown. So what we're going to do is jump into our game view controller.swift, and we need to create 2 additional variables on top of what we already created with our tap int variable. We need to create a start int variable, which is this is going to hold the value of the 3, 2, 1 that we're going to be using in the timer. We're then going to create a timer which again works with the 3, 2, 1 and enables us to trigger an action once we've reached the end of our timer, which is 0. So we create our first variable, and I'll call it our start int, and equal this to the value of 3, because we're going to be starting at 3 anyway. We're then going to create a secondary variable, and we're going to call this one our start timer, and equal this to something a little bit different. Now in the last lecture I talked about variables, they are what you equal them to. So if I equaled it to a number, it becomes an int. If I equaled it to a piece of text, it becomes a string. Now I want this one to become a timer. So I basically equal this to a timer, and we place in 2 brackets on the end. And there we go. This variable is now a timer. So when I reference it, again, I can only use stuff that timers are able to work with. So now we've got those 2 variables created. When the game initially loads, you can see it gets our 3 objects, adds the corner radius to them, gets our tap int, equals it to 0, and displays that within our score label. While it does all those, it's now going to do some additional pre-configurations. So we're going to get our start int, and again we're going to make sure that equals to 3. Even though we already set it up above, we're going to set it in stone that it equals 3 when the game first loads. We're then going to get our button, which we created it as an outlet and called that outlet our button, which you can see just up above here. We're going to simply set and simply change the title of it. So we do button.setTitle, and then we can change the text within the button and the control state upon it. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the title of the button equals the value of our start int. And this is where we can display the 3, 2, 1, 0. Once it reaches 0, we can then begin to play the game, and we'll then change the text back to tap me. So what we do is we add in our string. So very similar to how we got the tap int being displayed within our score label, we're going to now do our string, our 2 brackets, and inside of it, the name of our start int, which is start int, and there we go. So the text within our button is now going to display the number 3. And then in our UI control state, we do dot normal, as we don't want to change how we control and interact with the button itself. So we're going to go to build and run now. So as we had before, the button itself displayed the word tap me inside of it. Now, initially when the view loads up, I press start game, the button has the number 3 within it. So what we need to do is also make sure that this button is disabled and we can't interact with it, so our user can't cheat and start giving itself score before the game actually begins and plays. So at the same time it does all those pre-configurations, we're going to get our button, and then we do dot is enabled to simply equal false. And what that means is we're making sure the enabled feature, the ability to touch it, is equaling false, meaning disabled. So now when we go to build and run, we cannot interact with the button while we've called upon it to be disabled. So we just wait for the simulator to load up now. We go to start game, and you can see I can no longer interact with the button itself. cannot do anything at all. So now we've kind of created this, it now equals 3. We need to now create the timer to get it to start triggering this action to go 3, 2, 1, and then begin to play the game. So just below where we created our tap me button, we're going to space it out now so we can clearly see what we're doing. And we're going to create a brand new function. So we type out short for function here, and we do space, and I'll call it our start game timer, and then our 2 brackets at the end, then our parentheses, and press enter. So in between these 2 brackets, we're going to place in some code. And every time we call upon this start game timer function, it then performs what we place within the brackets. And what we want it to do is get our start int, then minus equals 1 every time it's called upon. So this is kind of the opposite to how we use our tap me button, where this one pluses 1 onto the int. Our start game timer is going to take away 1 from the int, creating the 3, 2, 1, again, countdown timer. And because we're having this displayed within our button, we need to simply adjust how it gets displayed. So whereas we have it, our tap int here being displayed as a string inside of our label, this one, how we do it is we get our button dot set title. So again, pretty much how we're doing it within the view did load. We set up our string, which is being displayed there for our, again, start int. And for control state here, we do dot normal because we're not adjusting how we interact or control the button itself. So now we've got that all set up, we need a function to be able to keep calling upon the function that we've just created. So in the view did load, as soon as it loads up, we're going to trigger our timer. Now our timer is something, basically think of our timer as a function that repeats itself over and over and over again. Now every time it repeats itself, we can then tell it to trigger a function statement. Now the function statement that we're going to tell it to trigger every time it repeats is our start game timer at the bottom. So we called upon our start timer at the top here, start timer, and then we simply equal this to a timer. Now we're going to set up all the configurations for it. Dot schedule timeout with time interval. You need the one that's got the selector, user info, and repeats there. Now in the first highlight section is our time interval. Within this we place a value. Now depending on the value depends on how often it triggers this function. For example, if I placed in the number 10, it means every 10 seconds it's gonna call upon itself. Or I could do 5, I could do 1. You can even work with decimal places. So I'm going to set it to 1 because we want it to do it like a real timer. Every second it's going to repeat itself. Now every time it repeats itself, we're going to set the target to itself so it works with it. And then in the selector, it's the function statement that it's going to call upon every second. So what we simply do is we do hash selector. There we go. We need the Objective-C there method there. Within the 2 brackets here, we're now placing the view of which our function is currently contained. So the name of our view, which is game view controller, then we do dot start game timer, which is the name of the function statement down below. And we've finished that there with the bracket. We got a comma, which goes into our new line. In the user info, we just simply do nil and repeats. This is important. Make sure you have this set to true, because if you have this set to false or anything else, it's only going to call upon it once. By setting it to repeat, it will repeat itself every second to what we set within the time interval, and it's going to call upon our start game timer function down below. Thus meaning every second it gets called upon, it's going to trigger this function. And every time it triggers it, it takes away 1 from our start int and displays that within our button. So now we're going to go to build and run and see exactly how this simply works. So as soon as the view loads up, again, this is all happening within the view did load of this view. So we press start game and then 3, 2, 1, 0. And it's going to continue to keep going down because we haven't told it yet at what point it needs to stop. And once it has stopped, what it needs to then do. Because again, we can't interact with it. We can't do anything with it at the moment. So back within this start game timer function here, we're going to space it out down below now. We'll scroll down so we can clearly see. We need to create an if statement. For if the start int equals a certain value, then we need to make sure the timer stops repeating itself, and then we can enable, or re-enable should I say, our button. So we do if our start int is equal to the value of 0, which is the last one we want to get it to, then we're going to get our start timer to simply dot invalidate. And what that means is we're going to simply stop the timer, stop while it's doing, stop it from repeating, just basically cancel it from doing anything else. And that will mean it won't then trigger itself again to go from 0 to -1, -2, -3, and so on and so on. So let's check this out and let's make sure it's doing exactly what we want it to do. So once it reaches 0, again, it's going to read that if statement. For if it equals that, then invalidate the timer. Do not go any further for us. So he goes 3, 2, 1, 0, and that's it. Perfect. We don't want it to go any further. So we now know that it cancels the timer at that given time. So again, within that 3, 2, 1 section there, it's giving our user time to adjust, time, giving them preparation, get ready to press that button as many times as they possibly can to start giving them score. But at the moment, it doesn't do anything. It still displays 0, and we can't interact with it. So what we need to do then, the first thing is we're going to then simply get our button, and we're then going to set the title of it to simply say, within our string here, tap me. And then for Euro control state here, we do .normal, keep it just like that. And at the same time it does that, we're going to get our button again, .is enabled to equal true. So that re-enables the button for us to start pressing it. And again, when we start pressing it, it starts adding 1 onto our int, or our tap int, should I say, to give us score. So now let's check this out then. When it gets re-enabled, it should do exactly what we've set it to do. So we just wait for it to load up now. So start game, we can't interact with the button as I click now. It gets all the way down to 0. Once it does, it changes it straight to tap me, and now I should be able to interact with the button. How cool is that? So we've now got our start game timer all set up. All that's left to do now then is create a secondary timer which is going to control the actual game time with the time remaining. And again, that's going to work very similar to how we've just created the 3, 2, 1, but this time starting from 10. So we go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way down to 0. And once that stops and gets to 0, then the game is over. We're then going to disable the tap me button so we can no longer get any score, and then push us to a secondary, or should I say a third view in our case, to where we can then see the score that we got within that allotted time, and then choose to either share it via Facebook or Twitter to friends or family, or even go straight to creating and starting a brand new game.